Keanu Reeves had always been observant. For months, he had noticed that David, his driver, made the same stop every night before heading home. At first, he didn't think much of it, but over time, the signs became impossible to ignore. The car running hotter than usual, the cautious glances in the rearview mirror, and the heavy silence between them. That night, curiosity got the best of him. Instead of going home, Keanu went back to check. The moment he turned the corner, he felt the tightness in his chest, but what he was about to discover would bring tears to your eyes. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The rain poured relentlessly over Los Angeles, turning the streets into shimmering mirrors that reflected the glow of streetlights and car headlights. Droplets clung to the car window, sliding down in erratic paths before vanishing into the darkness. The rhythmic patter of the rain against the roof was almost hypnotic, a steady whisper that filled the silence inside the car. Keanu Reeves was exhausted after a long day of meetings, interviews, and commitments. All he wanted was to get home and rest. Sitting in the passenger seat, he gazed out at the rain-drenched city, trying to let his mind go blank. But something about the car kept him alert. David, his driver, gripped the steering wheel with unusual stiffness. The way his fingers clenched the leather, the tension in his shoulders, and the slightly heavier breathing. Keanu noticed everything. He was good at noticing details. David was usually discreet, never wanting to start conversations, but tonight something felt off. His speech hesitated when answering simple questions. His glances flickered to the rearview mirror more often than usual, as if constantly checking for something. Keanu's eyes drifted to the dashboard, where small traces of adhesive tape clung to the surface, the kind left behind when something had been stuck there for a long time. A tablet mount, maybe, or a toy. Before he could think further, his hand brushed against something on the seat beside him. A small stuffed teddy bear, worn and slightly dirty, lay abandoned. Its plastic eyes reflected the soft glow of the dashboard lights. Keanu picked it up for a moment. Strange. He had never noticed anything like this in the car before. His gaze returned to David, who remained focused on the road ahead, his face carrying a weight that had nothing to do with mere exhaustion. And in that moment, Keanu realized David was carrying more than just the burden of a hard day. But what was he hiding? The rain had eased, but the city was still wrapped in a thin, cold mist. The sound of tires slicing through the wet asphalt echoed through the nearly deserted street. Keanu sat in silence as David drove, maneuvering the car into the same familiar spot, a quiet street near a small 24-hour gas station. Keanu had noticed this pattern before. Every time his late-night rides ended, David stopped here. At first, he hadn't thought much of it. Maybe it was just a convenient resting point before heading home. But now, after the subtle details he had picked up tonight, the hesitant glances, the tape marks on the dashboard, the forgotten teddy bear, he started to wonder if this was just a habit or something more. David turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Then, Keanu noticed something else. The car was warm. Too warm for someone who had just turned off the engine. That meant David had likely kept it running for a while before stopping. Why? Keanu glanced at the rearview mirror, trying to catch any movement in the back seat. It was dark, but then a faint sound reached his ears, the soft rustling of a package being opened. His body tensed. He couldn't see anything, but the sound unsettled him. It was food, like someone was carefully unwrapping something to eat. "Are you getting out here, Mr. Reeves?" David asked, his voice neutral but just a bit too stiff. Keanu hesitated. Part of him wanted to stay to observe, to figure out what was going on, but he also knew he didn't have a real reason to question David. Not yet. So he simply nodded. "Yeah, thanks, David." He grabbed his bag and stepped out of the car slowly. The cold night air hit his face as he took a few steps along the sidewalk. But something inside him made him stop. He turned discreetly and looked back at David through the car window. The driver hadn't left yet. He just sat there, motionless for a few seconds, then fiddled with something on the dashboard and glanced quickly at the rearview mirror, as if making sure Keanu was gone. Keanu's gut told him something was off. He didn't know exactly what, But he couldn't shake the feeling. Taking a deep breath, he kept walking home. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Keanu walked away, but the feeling that something was wrong never left him. He didn't know why, but he was sure he hadn't seen everything yet. Keanu tossed and turned in bed, sleep slipping away like sand through his fingers. The scene from earlier that night wouldn't leave his mind. David parking in the same spot as always, hesitating, the car warmer than it should be, the sound of a package rustling in the back seat. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just tired, seeing patterns where there were none. Maybe it was just a habit. But something inside him screamed that there was more to the story. Keanu wasn't the type to ignore his intuition. He knew when something was off. He glanced at the clock. It was past 2 a.m. sighing. He sat up and ran a hand through his hair. The only way to shake this feeling was to see for himself. He grabbed a jacket, his keys, and headed out. The night air was colder than before, and the city streets were nearly empty at this hour. Traffic had died down, leaving only an occasional car passing in the distance. Keanu drove slowly, an uneasy feeling growing inside him as he approached the street where David always stopped. He turned off his headlights and slowed down, and there it was. David's car was still parked in the exact same spot. Keanu pulled over a few meters away, staying out of sight. As he watched, David was in the driver's seat, but he wasn't asleep. He was awake, staring ahead, lost in thought. Something wasn't right. Keanu studied the scene. It was late. If David had a home, he should have been there by now. But he wasn't. He was still here in the same place, with no intention of leaving. Then it happened. A second car approached and pulled up near the gas station. Keanu leaned forward, watching carefully. A woman stepped out. She was carrying something in her arms. David got out of his car and walked toward her. They exchanged a few quick words, and then Keanu saw it. David opened the back door of his car and took someone into his arms. A child. Keanu's eyes widened. David held a small sleeping figure, wrapping them in a jacket to keep them warm. In that moment, everything clicked. The overheated car, the same stops every night, the forgotten teddy bear. David wasn't just resting there every night. He was waiting. And now Keanu knew this was something much bigger. Keanu gripped the steering wheel, his heart pounding. He didn't know the full story yet, but one thing was clear. David wasn't just a driver taking a break. He was hiding something, and Keanu needed to find out what. Keanu drove back home, but his mind was elsewhere. The image of David holding the child in his arms wouldn't leave his head. A tight knot formed in his chest, an unease that was impossible to ignore. When he arrived at his apartment, he collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. He tried to convince himself that this wasn't his business. David was just his driver. But the truth was, Keanu had never been the kind of person to look away when something felt wrong. And no matter how much he tried to push it aside, a memory from the past began to surface. Many years ago, before fame, before money, and before red carpets, Keanu knew what it was like to feel lost. He remembered the cold nights in Toronto, crashing on borrowed couches, or sometimes sleeping in his own car. He remembered the uncertainty of not having a real home, the constant fear that tomorrow would be worse than today. And he remembered a face, the face of a man who did something simple yet life-changing. Keanu never knew his name. He only remembered that he was an older man who owned a small auto repair shop. One day, when Keanu was struggling the most, that man gave him work. It wasn't a real job, just odd tasks here and there, changing tires, organizing tools, cleaning up. But it was enough. Enough to help him get back on his feet, to save a little money, to take the next steps. And it was the first time he truly understood the difference between simply giving money and giving someone a real chance. Now, lying on his couch, staring at the ceiling, Keanu realized why David's situation bothered him so much. Because he saw himself in him. Keanu exhaled, running his hands down his face. If he ignored what he had seen, David and his daughter would continue living like this. But if he did something, what exactly could he do? He sat there for a long time, torn between stepping in and staying out of it, until finally, he made his decision. Tomorrow, he would talk to David, and no matter what the driver said, Keanu wasn't going to let him keep living like this. Keanu looked at David, now sleeping in the car. The difference between them was that he had been given a chance to change. Now, he would give that chance to someone else. The sun was setting slowly over Los Angeles, painting the sky in golden and orange hues. Keanu gazed at the horizon through his apartment window, but his mind was elsewhere. The image of David holding a child in his arms from the night before wouldn't leave him. He had already made his decision. Now, he just needed to find the best way to act on it. He picked up his phone and sent a message to David. * pick me up at 7 p.m. I feel like having dinner somewhere different tonight. * the reply came quickly. As always. Yes, Mr. Reeves. Keanu stared at the screen for a few seconds before putting the phone away. He needed to approach this carefully. He couldn't just offer David help outright. It might hurt his pride. He had to find a way that David could accept without feeling like a burden. And he already had a plan. At exactly 7 p.m., David's black car pulled up in front of the building. Keanu stepped in and greeted him with a small smile. Good evening, David. Good evening, Mr. Reeves. Where to? Keanu crossed his arms, pretending to think. I feel like something more homely tonight. Do you know any restaurants with a family atmosphere? Good food and no paparazzi. David considered for a moment before answering. I know a small Italian place downtown. Great food, nothing fancy, but very cozy. Keanu smiled. Perfect. Let's go there. As David drove, Keanu observed his posture. He looked tired, more than usual. The way he gripped the steering wheel, the occasional slow blinks. Everything pointed to exhaustion. Keanu wanted to ask how he was doing, but he knew this wasn't the time. He had to wait for the right moment. The restaurant was small and inviting, just as David had described. The warm lighting gave it a homey feel, and the scent of fresh tomato sauce filled the air. They took a seat near the window, and a waiter quickly brought menus. Keanu, always discreet, pulled his cap lower and kept his head down to avoid drawing attention. David studied the menu carefully, almost too carefully, as if making mental calculations. Keanu noticed the hesitation. He recognized it. It was the same look he once had when money was tight, and every menu choice had to be made cautiously. Keanu placed his order quickly, a pasta dish and a glass of wine. Then, he turned his attention to David, who was still hesitating. Order whatever you want, Keanu said casually. David nodded slowly and chose a simple dish, along with a glass of water. Silence stretched between them for a few moments before Keanu decided to break it. How long have you been driving for me, David? A little over 2 years, sir. Call me Keanu, he corrected with a slight smile. David nodded but didn't respond immediately. Keanu could tell he wasn't the type to talk much about himself, but tonight he needed him too. Do you like the job? Keanu asked, taking a sip of his wine. David let out a small smile. I do. You're a good boss. Thank you. But I meant the job itself. David was quiet for a moment before replying. Lying. It's honest work. Doesn't pay much, but it's honest. Keanu analyzed his words. He sensed that David wanted to say more, but held back. And outside of work, how's life? David stirred his fork in his plate, avoiding eye contact. Surviving, he answered shortly. That word hung heavy in the air. Keanu knew he couldn't push, so he decided to change his approach. You know, David, he began, looking out the window. When I was younger, I went through some really tough times. David lifted his eyes, curious. I know what it's like to sleep in a car. I know what it's like to not know where your next meal is coming from. David sat still. I don't talk about it much because people assume Hollywood is all glamour, but the truth is, before all this, I was just trying to survive. David took a deep breath as if absorbing every word. During that time, Keanu went on, a man came along and gave me a chance. He didn't give me money. He gave me work. He gave me dignity. A heavy silence fell between them. Keanu now looked directly at David. You don't have to tell me anything, but I know something's going on. I'm not blind. David lowered his eyes. Keanu hesitated, then asked, Do you have somewhere to sleep tonight? David closed his eyes for a second before answering. Yes. Keanu noticed the hesitation. In your car? He asked directly. David swallowed hard. Yes. Keanu let out a long sigh. And your daughter? David's eyes widened, his expression tense. How do you know? Keanu rested his elbows on the table. Because I pay attention. Because something didn't add up. Because I've been there. David rubbed his face, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't want you to know, he murmured. Why not? Keanu asked. Because I don't want pity. Keanu shook his head. Who said I'm offering you pity? David looked at him, surprised. Keanu took a deep breath before speaking again. I don't want to give you charity, David. I want to give you a chance. David remained silent. I have an empty apartment, Keanu said. It's not luxury, but it's safe. I want you and your daughter to stay there until you can get something better. David started shaking his head. I can't accept that. You can, and you will, Keanu insisted. David clenched his fists, as if battling himself. I don't want to be a burden. Keanu smirked. Then don't be. Look at this as a fresh start. David held the keys in his hand, feeling their weight, both real and symbolic. The cold metal against his skin seemed almost unreal after so long without a home, without a stable place to call his own. He was now holding something that could change everything. He looked at Keanu, who watched him with a calm smile. No pressure, no expectations. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was simply someone offering a fresh start. But accepting it was still hard. Emily stood beside her father, clutching her teddy bear, observing everything with curious eyes. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could sense her father's hesitation. Are you sure? David asked, his voice nearly breaking. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I've never been more sure of anything. David looked at the keys again. He took a deep breath, then finally nodded. Let's see the place. Keanu led David and Emily to the building. It wasn't a luxurious place, but it was safe, comfortable, and most importantly, a home. When David unlocked the door and stepped inside, he hesitated. The air in the room felt heavier. For a moment, he stood at the entrance, absorbing the strange feeling of being in a space where he wouldn't have to recline a car seat to sleep, where he wouldn't have to worry about the police knocking on his window in the middle of the night. Emily, on the other hand, was already cautiously stepping inside, letting go of her father's hand to explore. It's huge, she exclaimed, running down the hallway. David watched his daughter move through the apartment, her eyes lighting up as she discovered each room for the first time. For the first time in a long while, he felt something different, hope. Keanu leaned against the wall, watching everything with a satisfied smile. Everything you need is here. It's simple but cozy. And while you're getting back on your feet, you don't have to worry about rent or bills. David shook his head, still struggling to process everything. I don't know how to thank you. Keanu crossed his arms. Then don't. Just accept it. David let out a nervous laugh and rubbed his face. You really won't take no for an answer, will you? Keanu smirked. Not a chance. Emily reappeared in the living room, holding something in her hands. Do I have my own room? Keanu smiled. Of course. And you can decorate it however you like. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. Daddy, can I have stars on the ceiling? David looked at his daughter, feeling his chest tighten. He didn't want to rely on anyone, but for the first time, he realized this wasn't about pride. It was about giving his daughter something she had never had before, stability. He knelt down beside Emily and took her hands in his. Of course, sweetheart. She squealed with joy and ran back to explore her new room. David turned back to Keanu, still grappling with the emotions of the moment. I promise I'll repay you for this. Keanu smirked. You already are. How? David followed Keanu's gaze and saw Emily lying on the floor of her new room, already imagining how she would set it up. In that moment, he understood. The next morning, Keanu took David to a special place. It was a small auto repair shop owned by an old friend of his. You know how to fix cars, right? Keanu asked. David nodded. I used to work in a shop before everything fell apart. Good, because I told the owner about you, and he's willing to give you a trial. David was speechless. He looked at Keanu, a mix of shock and gratitude in his eyes. I don't even know what to say. Then don't say anything. Just prove you deserve this chance. The shop owner stepped out of the garage and extended a hand. "Keanu told me about you. Let's see what you can do." David shook his hand firmly. "I won't let you down." Keanu smiled. "I know you won't." That night, after his first day at work, David returned to the apartment and found Emily peacefully asleep in bed. He walked over quietly and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We made it, princess," he murmured. She stirred in her sleep and hugged her teddy bear tighter. David stood up and walked to the living room, where Keanu was gazing out the window. "Is she okay?" Keanu asked. David nodded. "Better than ever." There was a long pause before David spoke again. "You changed our lives," he said. Keanu smiled slightly. "No, you changed them. I just gave you a push." David took a deep breath, feeling the weight he had carried for so long finally begin to lift. "I'll never forget this, Keanu." Keanu patted him on the shoulder. "Just promise me one thing." "What?" "When you're back on your feet, when you're stable, help someone else." David was silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then he smiled. "I promise." David felt the weight of the keys in his hand. He wanted to refuse, but when he looked at Emily, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. A few weeks had passed since David and Emily moved into their new home. Life had begun to settle into something resembling normal. David worked long hours at the auto repair shop, determined to prove himself, while Emily started attending school, something she had never been able to do consistently before. For the first time in a long while, David could breathe without the constant weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Keanu had stepped back, giving them space to adjust. He never wanted David to feel like he owed him something. He just wanted to help in the way that someone once helped him. But what neither of them knew was that this act of kindness was about to go far beyond just the two of them. That night, Keanu stepped onto his balcony, looking up at the sky. The world had a way of surprising him sometimes. All it took was one small act to create something far greater. And as he looked up at the stars, he smiled because he knew without a doubt this was only the beginning. Keanu looked up at the starry sky and smiled. The world needed more moments like this, and it all started with one simple act of kindness. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.